Cloud of Doom, chapters 21 and 22. Chapter 21, Breathe. Stephen stared at the clock on the wall. What if he couldn't lift the mallet? What if he dropped it on his toe? What if he dropped it on Mr. Kidswater's toe? He could be expelled. Breathe, said Jason from the desk next to him. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. What if someone left a skateboard on the stairs? Then he might trip over it on his way to the gong. If he broke his leg, Mr. Kidswater would yell at him for being late. Breathe, said Rondi from the desk on the other side. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. Sometimes it seemed the hands didn't move at all. Other times he'd blink, and it would be half an hour later. Time didn't always make sense at Wayside School. For lunch, Miss Mush made a pepper-only pizza. Pepper only instead of pepperoni. Stephen ate his slice, but did not remember eating it. His only clue was that he was very thirsty and his tongue and lips burned. He returned to his seat in Mrs. Jewell's class. He stared at the clock. Jenny was late coming back from lunch. Sorry, Mrs. Jewell, she said. I can't find my skateboard. Oh, no, Stephen shouted. Are you all right, Stephen? Mrs. Jewell asked him. Why did he have to pick me? Stephen moaned. If you didn't want to do it, why'd you raise your hand? Asked Mac. Everyone else had their hands raised, Stephen explained. I guess I was excited about it at the time, but now... You have cold feet, said Mrs. Jewell. Yes, exclaimed Stephen. He wondered how Mrs. Jewell knew that. His feet felt like 2 blocks of ice. No wonder she was a teacher. But what did his frozen feet have to do with ringing the gong? Breathe, said Mrs. Jewell. Stephen took a breath. Mrs. Jewell's class always had music on Friday afternoons. I'm sorry, we don't have the musical instruments today, she announced. They were sent out to be cleaned, and we haven't gotten them back yet. What if the gong was being washed too? Would he have to bang it on a different day? Breathe, said Kathy. Stephen took a breath. So just use what you were born with, said Mrs. Jewell. And a 1, and a 2. Dana loudly blew her nose. Ron twiddled his lips. Mac puffed out his cheek and popped it with the flick of a finger. Calvin and Bebe whistled. Joe stood on his head and sang Jingle Bells. Paul pulled Leslie's pigtails. She shrieked, squealed, or squawked, depending on the pull. Stop the music, Mrs. Jewell suddenly shouted, and the room became instantly quiet. Stephen, you're late, she told him. I'm sorry, I was so carried away by the music I didn't notice the time. Time, said Stephen. Now, Stephen, said Mrs. Jewell. He remained frozen in his chair. Mrs. Jewell asked Jason and Rondi to help. They moved to either side of Stephen and slowly lifted him to a standing position. It's time, buddy, said Jason. Time? Stephen repeated. He took 1 step, then stopped. Now the other leg, said Rondi. He took another step. You can do it, Stephen, cheered Kathy. Bang that gong like no one ever banged it before, called Joy. Stephen walked across the room. He stepped out the door behind him. He heard the entire class shout together, Breathe! Stephen took a breath. Chapter 22, The Moment. Stephen was worrying his way down the stairs when suddenly he spotted Jenny's skateboard right in the middle of a step. He stepped over it. Well, that was easy. And just like that, his fears vanished. Not even the cloud of doom worried him. He quickly hurried the rest of the way down. He didn't want to be late. When he reached the 2nd floor, he could see Lewis below, wheeling the gong into place. Lewis, he shouted, and then jumped down the final 8 steps. Am I late? You're right on time, said the yard teacher. The gong was gigantic, almost twice as big as Stephen. He had never stood so close to it before. In the center was a small red dot. The iron mallet hung from the hook. The mallet was longer than his arm, and thicker too. Have you been doing your push-ups? Lewis asked. Stephen nodded. I'm almost up to 2, he said confidently. Mr. Kidswater stepped out of his office. He took 1 look at Stephen and asked, Who are you? This is Stephen, said Lewis. You chose him to bang the gong today? Him? Why would I choose him? Because you're the best principal ever, said Lewis. Well, yes, that is true, said Mr. Kidswater. I'll do my best, sir, said Stephen. That's what worries me, said the principal. Lewis handed Stephen 2 cotton balls. As Stephen was stuffing them in his ears, Lewis unhooked the mallet. He held it out to Stephen. Stephen wobbled as he took the mallet with both hands. Lewis helped him raise it to his shoulder. Mr. Kidswater checked his watch and then started the countdown. 10, 9, 8. He had to shout the numbers so Stephen could hear him through the cotton balls. 7, 6. Stephen tightened his grip on the handle. 5, 4. Stephen groaned loudly as he slowly raised the iron mallet up off his shoulders. It was a good thing he had been doing it all those push-downs. 3. Stephen staggered but maintained his balance. 2. He concentrated on the red dot. 1. He swung with all his might and missed. He didn't just miss the red dot, he missed the whole gong. Lewis jumped out of the way as the weight of the mallet pulled Stephen around in a circle. The second time around, the mallet banged into the gong, right on the dot. Gong, 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 gong. Despite the cotton balls, the sound echoed inside Stephen's skull and rattled his bones. Gong, 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 gong. It traveled up the stairs all the way to the 30th floor. Gong, 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 gong. He did it! Shouted Mac. Yay, Stephen! Yelled Jenny. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class whooped and hollered. Lewis kept Stephen from falling over and took the mallet from him. He hooked it to the frame, and then he and Stephen wheeled the gong into the principal's office. Mr. Kidswatter was already there, standing by the door. The principal held out his big hand and said, "Well done, Stephen." In the history of Wayside School, Stephen was the only kid to ever shake Mr. Kidswatter's hand. In the future, whenever Stephen feels worried or frustrated or just plain sad, his mind will take him back to the moment the mallet struck that gong. He will close his eyes and see the red dot. His hands will feel the weight of the iron mallet. He will hear the sound of the gong bouncing back and forth between his ears and will smile and will feel the vibrations in his bones, and he will smile.